goes and goes, this show. Before you know it,
That's
it's
good.
over. Yeah, well, thanks. I'm glad you, hey,
I'm
maybe,
having fun.
maybe you'll hear it sometime. Sorry, was that?
I got to get in a car. I got to get in a car first.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Do you walk? Do you run? That's when I do most of my podcast listening these days, is when I walk or run.
I should be walking.
Oh.
I do sometimes.
All
It's
right.
something I keep saying I'm going to do.
Yeah.
But it's been a little crazy with work the last couple months.
Yeah.
So I've kind of let things slide.
Basically, as soon as, because I go through spurts where I'm off and on running. I was actually running pretty consistently about 2 years ago. And then I ran a bit about a year ago. And then I sort of like, I'm off and on, off and on. And when the lockdown started, when the whole thing, did I say your name, by the way? Adam Christianson is with us, everybody. Adam Christianson, MacCast.com, MACCAST, MacCast.com. Host, of course, of the podcast, the MacCast, which we'll get to in just a moment. But first, more about me. So as soon as the lockdown started, I was like, man, I'm not going to let anything beat me. I'm going to start running, because I figured the lockdown was going to be, 4 weeks, maybe 6.
Right.
I've lost my zeal for running now, especially
like all of us.
Especially like at night the other day. I went out for a walk at 11 at night the other night, 79 degrees. I'm not running in that. Are you nuts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not fun.
No, it's not fun. But the same could be said of so many things these days. Right. So we talked earlier this week about the fact that the first time I met you was at that was the first podcast expo, right? 2005. It was the podcast expo. It was the one
Podcast expo. Yeah.
one of the ones. The first 3 of them were in Ontario, California. And for anybody who is a podcaster now who did not get to participate in that, I feel for you, because it was magic, because podcasting was new. Podcasters were nerds, and then all of a sudden there was this tiny little like distant suburb of LA, apparently, where there were, I want to say, maybe 6 hotels. 4 of them had bars, or maybe there were 4 hotels and 2 of them had bars. And for like 2 days or 3 days, if you saw anybody who wasn't driving someplace, if they were just walking around, they were another podcaster. Rachel Depp, Nicole Hazler, Adam Christianson, us, of course, Laura Burstein, Scott Shepard, me, other people whose names I can't even remember anymore. Bill Palmer, Shelley Brisbane. I met Shelley Brisbane, I think, at the second podcast expo.
Tim Verborten. I think Allison was there at some point. I don't know if she was there the first one, but
Okay.
definitely I met her for the first time in Ontario.
That's interesting, because I didn't meet Allison the first time, I don't believe, until the whole thing moved to Vegas in 2008, which is also where I met Chuck Joyner and where I met Barry Folk and just a bunch of other guys. Michael Johnston, I know, was at that podcast expo, although I think I knew him before that. Anyway, it was a magic time. It's really neat to have been around at the beginning. I say, though, that you predate me by a lot, because I didn't go out on my own until 2006, and you started MacCast 2004?
2004.
Yeah, that's crazy. How'd you hear about it? How'd you get started? Why'd you get started? What?
Yeah, that's the origin story. That's a great story, actually. So I was working for Upper Deck, the trading card company.
Yeah.
In Carlsbad, and I was commuting and driving, so I had a commute. I honestly don't know how I found podcasts, but I found out about this thing called podcasts. Figured out the technology to actually get them, because we didn't have iTunes. We didn't have, it was literally an RSS feed, and you basically, I think Adam Curry had cobbled together some sort of like Apple script that you could like point a feed at a feed, and then it would like pull down audio files, and then you would sync them to your whatever MP3 player you had at the time. And so I was listening to podcasts. It was like Don and there was just a handful. There was Don and Drew. There was Evil Genius Chronicles. There was
Rock and Roll Geek Show.
I never got into Rock and Roll Geek Show, but yeah, that was around then. I'm trying to think of some of the few earlier ones. But the ones I was listening to were Daily Source Code, Don and Drew, and Evil Genius Chronicles, I think, were the ones. And I went looking for Apple Podcasts, And I said, like, I'm into Mac stuff. I'd love to get like my Apple news every day rather than having to go to a bunch of blogs. I could just listen to it in the car on my way to work. And so I went hunting, and there was really not any Apple podcasts at the time. There were Apple shows. There was Scott Shepard and was that Inside Mac Radio?
That was Inside Mac, yeah.
The name of the show? And then there was Sean King's Your Mac Life.
Yeah.
But they were streaming on Real Audio, I think, was how you would get them at the time, maybe. I'm trying to remember. They were streaming, but not really available in a RSS feed form. I think Sean did at some point start taking his streamed audio and chopping it up and putting it into a feed. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so the way it happened was I was looking for a show. It didn't exist. A lot of people were saying, hey, with GarageBand and a USB mic, you can make a podcast. And I went, well, maybe if I'm looking for this thing, maybe there's other people looking for this thing. And I was always into like Mac user groups and sort of helping people learn to use Macs and things like that. So I kind of saw it as an opportunity. I could kind of like sum up the news, because I was reading all the blogs and stuff like that. And so do news commentary, my take on, the latest stories and things like that. And then maybe help people, let people email in or send in questions, and then I could help them with their technology. And so that was really the genesis of the show. And I would go out in my lunch hour with my 14-inch iBook and this cheap Logitech USB mic and sit in my car and record the show. And originally it was going to be like a daily show, just like 10 or 15 minutes. And then it just sort of evolved from there. But really what happened was my very first show, I don't know how this happened, put it out there. Remember, again, there's no iTunes, there's no discovery, there's no directory. How this person found my show, I have no idea. But I did the first show and I got an email and somebody asked me a question. I think on the second or third episode, I was able to answer someone's question and help them with their technology. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty amazing. I am connecting with people out there in the world through this technology. I have no idea how they found it, but I like this feeling. I want to keep doing this. And so I just sort of kept doing it for a long time. I didn't even kind of tell my family that I was doing it because I didn't know if it was going to be a thing or not. I was a little maybe not embarrassed by it, but I didn't know if it was going to stick. I didn't know if it was just going to be something I was going to try and drop, and obviously I didn't. So
that's pretty far out.
Started.
Yeah. How do you? Well, see, I want to ask you a question, but I don't. But then I think, okay, if he asked me that question, I couldn't answer it.
Oh, ask me.
So okay. So what's the most magical thing that's happened? Because the reason. Well, we met that time at that thing. The reason I ended up at working with Roddenberry for a while is because Rod Roddenberry one day was standing in line for an iPhone. This guy with a microphone walked up to him and asked him a question. The guy with the microphone who walked up to him and asked him the question is Adam Christianson. And Rod at that point didn't even know what a podcast was. And he apparently talked to you, or maybe he had heard about podcasts but hadn't found any. He talked to you about your podcast. That's how he found podcasts. That's how he found me. That's how I found my way into working for Roddenberry for a number of years. And weird things like that happened. Like last week, because I was off the week before on macOS Ken, I didn't have in a few minutes for last week, but I had been collecting Disney questions that I was asking people as we went through. You're trapped in Disneyland. Where do you sleep? I got an email last week from somebody who works for Imagineering. Things like that don't happen, except that you just put yourself out there and then stuff happens, right?
They do, yeah.
And there are like a million, not a million, there are like 6 stories like that I can tell, but there's 6 stories that I love and that I treasure. What's been like, you don't necessarily have to say the most magic, but what's been like a magical thing that's happened because, you decided, I'm going to go sit in my car and record for 15 minutes.
Yeah. Well, obviously, randomly meeting Rod Roddenberry at an iPhone launch. Yeah,
that's cool.
That was a trip. But I think you can sum it up in a lot of experiences like that. A lot of opportunities. I think really the most magical is the expansive community that I've become involved with. People like yourself and Victor Cahiao and David Sparks and Allison and Chuck and like all these people that I would not have the connections with these people without podcasting. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, and not only that, then expanding beyond just those podcasters as friends into the community around that. So, and the sharing of audiences and stuff like that, which is just a bizarre thing if you think about it. You think about like traditional media, and it's always a competition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we want to lock in and we want to exclusively have this audience, and we don't want you going over to that other show, like don't go there. And in our community, it's not like that. It's like, yeah, come on in, let's talk, let's hang out, let's listen to each other's shows, let's have a conversation, and I think the magic of that is one of the things, like I said, when I started, that I really wanted to kind of preserve and maybe even take on a more larger or global scale was the user group. Because I was very involved with the user groups. I was on board of directors for the Portland Mac Users Group, the San Diego Mac Users Group, always heavily involved. And what I loved about that was the interaction with other Mac users, because I had this concept of fresh eyes. So people would say to me, like, oh my gosh, you must know everything about Apple and you know all this stuff. How do you know all this stuff? And I would say, I really don't, because I know what I know, and it's a lot. But I will tell you, I have so many conversations in a Mac user group where I'll say, somebody asks me, how do you do A, B, and C? And then you start to tell them, oh, here's how you do it. And then somebody will be right next to me listening and go, oh, that's interesting. I do it a completely different way, or I know this. And so it's that sharing of ideas and information. And so the magical thing about podcasting in this community is you can recreate that interaction and those connections online. And I think maybe because it's audio and not just like a blog or text, it's a more personal connection. So it's closer to that in-person sort of user group exchange of ideas, I think, than any other format that exists online, in my opinion. And people kind of feel like, because you're in their head every day, that they kind of know you, and they do to a certain degree, right? You're sharing a lot. And so it's a pretty close analogy. It's not as great as meeting in person, but we do get to have meetups, we get to have podcast expos, we get to have Mac stocks, right? And we do all get together, and when you get in those situations, it's like being with family again. Everybody's just kind of hanging out. It's like you just pick up where you left off the last time you saw that person, and sometimes you don't see those people for years, but it's an amazing thing. And so I would say that's probably one of the most magical things that's come out of this.
Yeah, and I'm a jerk, and I'm just talking about famous people.